10 too.
Sure, happy to do it.
Yeah, welcome to Stout.
Okay, hello everybody. Hi, good afternoon. I'm Tim Shiell. I'm a professor of philosophy here at UW-Stout, and I'm director of the Menard Center for the Study of Institutions and Innovation, hosting today's Free Speech Week event. This is our third event of the week. We've really enjoyed our first two. I'm sure we have two very lively gentlemen, outspoken and well-spoken, and we're going to have a very interesting conversation. Just a couple of things before we get that underway. We've been having some problems with the chat function, so we're going to sort of skip that. And when it comes time for audience Q&A at about 5:15-ish, please use the raise your hand function, which should be on the toolbar at the top of your screen. I'll say that this is a little bit of an experiment. Rather than do a sort of standard academic presentation of however many minutes for each speaker and then going to Q&A, I thought it'd be fun to mix it up. And I'm just going to introduce our two guests. I'm going to throw a question out, and they'll each have a few minutes to answer that, and then we'll just go with it. I'm sure 45 minutes is going to fly by. So here we go. One of our guests today is JC Hallman. He is an acclaimed nonfiction writer. He's published 6 books, is working on number 7. He is the recipient of some pretty prestigious fellowships from the McKnight and Guggenheim Foundations. He did a history of a Central Park statue of the so-called father of gynecology, J. Marion Sims, and he wrote a piece that appeared in Harper's Magazine that played a role in the city of New York eventually deciding to take that statue down. I believe the first such case in New York's history. He's now at work on a dual biography of Sims and his so-called first cure, a young enslaved woman known as Anarcha. Our other guest speaking with us today is James Pesta, goes by Duke. He's a professor of English at UW-Oshkosh. He is a Shakespeare scholar. He published a book in 2016 titled Renaissance Literature and the Postmodern. He's an outspoken person on his campus and has attracted lots of attention for and against, and we're really enjoying his being with us here today. So I'm going to launch us off with a question about what exactly cancel culture is. When I read about it and hear people talk about it, it's not always clear to me they're even necessarily talking about the same phenomenon or what that phenomenon is. You know, if it's new, if it's been around, if it's just a new version of an old thing, what separates cancel culture from just ordinary give and take of free speech criticism or that sort of thing. So I'd like to just hear from both of you kind of your take on that. We'll start with JC and then Duke can jump in.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Duke, and hello to everybody. I guess I'm here because I wrote a piece after the famous Harper's letter of summer 2020 came out. And my piece was called In Defense of Cancel Culture, and I think that's why I am here. And I tend to think of cancel culture sort of breaking it up. You know, if you the cancel part of it, I think sort of has 2 parts itself. The first part is that I think the word cancel itself probably comes from television, the phenomenon stretching back a few years, maybe to when, you know, Fox News was going through its turmoil with Bill O'Reilly and Roger Ailes, and the cancel language seems to be a way of referencing, you know, what happens to a television show when it's taken off the air. It's canceled. And so I think of it that way, but really what that means is something that just gets called in other places deplatforming, where someone is in some kind of position of authority that they have some form of influence for some reason, and there is an attempt by individuals or maybe a large group of people to remove them from that platform. And I think thinking of it as a platform is very useful because it becomes more inclusive for the phenomenon as a whole. Because, you know, if you think of phrases like, you know, put up on a pedestal or up on a soapbox, you know, being on a platform suggests that elevated position, and also sort of speaks to the other phenomenon, not necessarily just, you know, say magazine editors or talking heads with television shows or university professors who have platforms, but literally statues, figures from the past who have an ongoing influence on the present, who are literally standing on a platform. I think the culture part of cancel culture then speaks to something that Harper's letter is trying to get at, the effect of these efforts to remove people from their positions of authority or to deplatform them is resulting, I believe this is what the Harper's letter is trying to get at, though I don't agree with their argument, and I think it's a bit duplicitous in how it's delivered, that their concern is that not only is this happening, but that there is a fear that is sort of creeping into the way discourse and discussion happens in the culture, in the society, and that makes people fearful of engaging in discussion about controversial topics, and that they think that this is a disadvantage and it's something that we should discourage. So not necessarily the actual actions of removing people from their platforms, but even the fear of it is something that I think cancel culture is beginning to speak to.
Thanks. How about Duke?
Well, I wanted to take the opportunity to thank everybody, both in the audience for joining us. I'd like to thank JC for being willing to be here, Tim for the invite. And I think largely what JC said makes sense. I would not qualify. I'm a little less qualificating when I come to cancel culture. I think it can be said really pretty simply. Cancel culture, whether we're looking at it from the cancel or the culture perspective, is when we move beyond the willingness to hear and critique other people, even in vehement ways, to trying to punish people. There's dissent. We all have the right to dissent. I think that people have the right to react strongly against speech they don't like. I think people have the right to dissent vehemently against ideas that they don't like. But when that dissent turns into punishment, when we get to the point where we're deplatforming people, as JC says, we're using our power, particularly in the media, particularly at the universities and in the schools. To me, those are the main areas where we see cancel culture. The other place I would say is entertainment. And all of the four of those things have in common is that they're all media-driven ways of understanding things. Schools now are in the news. We've got constantly we're seeing university people finding themselves run afoul, not even just of the faculty, but of students. One of the worst aspects of cancel culture for me as a professor is how administrators, care much more what offends a student than they do what free speech really means. Free speech, First Amendment rights, means that you have every right to defend yourself, to not like things, to not want to take sitting down certain comments or remarks. But you don't have the right to deem something hate speech because you don't like it. And the idea that we are more and more becoming comfortable with the idea that certain people with certain backgrounds have the right to stop speech because they don't like it or that it hurts their feelings somehow is a very tricky thing and a dangerous slope. So for me, I think you see cancel culture primarily. You see it in Hollywood. How many actors? I was just watching today. You had this Avengers reunion to fight against President Trump in the name of Joe Biden. And a Christian, and he's taking a lot of heat right now from Hollywood people because he's a Christian and he didn't show up for this Biden event. Well, they're trying to cancel him. I mean, you have a lot of other actors who are calling him out. You have a lot of fans that are saying that he shouldn't work in Hollywood anymore. And why I'm only bringing this up now because this is an interesting anecdote I saw today. So his colleague, Mark Ruffalo, who played the Hulk in the Avengers movies, he actually came to the defense of his friend Chris Pratt. And he defended Chris Pratt not on the basis of free speech. He did not say that Chris has his right to his worldview, his religion, his views. We should honor them as we honor our own. He didn't say that. He said that Chris is acceptable because he's not overly political with his opinions. So Ruffalo, who's a radical left-winger with a huge platform, who has said some shockingly outlandish things about conservatives, about traditional aspects of Western culture, I don't begrudge him. He has the right to say those things. He now has decided to try to calm the storm around Chris Pratt, not by saying he has the right to say those things too, like I would say, like Chris has said, but instead he says, as long as he's not overly political with his support for Trump, we see him as somebody who's a good guy. That right there, I think, in that little anecdote, carries the disproportionate way that this is done. And certainly as a professor on a college campus for 25 years, I have seen it in that environment. Who decides which is the hurtful speech? Who gets to decide which arguments hurt people's feelings? In monolithic organizations like universities, or Hollywood for that matter, it's always the progressive left who gets to decide them. And that's what makes it so dangerous. There's no bipartisan commission. There is no attempt to balance the offensive nature of speech along all different kinds of discourse and political backgrounds. It always seems to run one way. And that's what makes it so dangerous, right? That I don't want conservatives canceling anybody at all. I would be adverse to that. But as a conservative living in a very liberal environment, I can't help but notice the hypocrisy that radical things that liberals say are almost immediately protected by the institution. We allow our scholars free speech, free association, but then we see these conservative professors, we see conservative students who say things as problematic on the right as we just heard on the left, and suddenly it's not so clear cut that universities are willing to protect that kind of speech. So to me, that double standard is why we're focusing now on cancel culture, because there is a double standard in the most high level aspects of how this is being treated in culture. And that to me is where it gets, it walks down a very, very dangerous, almost fascist road when one group gets to decide whose feelings matter at the expense of other people.
JC, you want to go from there?
Well, I'm a little hesitant to comment on the Pratt thing because I'm not really familiar with it. But I would say that it doesn't really sound like an example of cancel culture to me, because I doubt that Chris Pratt is going to wind up being canceled. What is actually meant by this? If cancel means that you have lost your platform, you have been deplatformed, then it doesn't seem to me that Chris Pratt is in any danger of being deplatformed, and that a lot of the examples that were cited of this, even in the Harper's letter that gave a lot of oxygen to this whole argument, are examples of people who did not get removed from their position at all. And I think that that's an important distinction. It's because to my mind, if what you're experiencing is that people who are accustomed to not having a voice at all are now able to express their opinion about what offends them, and now you have to address that. Well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And if you go through a procedure, if your friends come to your defense, or if your administration initiates a protocol that's already in place to evaluate, whether a line, an institutional line is crossed, and you are left in your position, then you haven't been canceled. It's not really a cancel culture question. And it shouldn't be wrong. We shouldn't be discouraging people from saying what it is that offends them. I think something else that Duke said that is worth touching on is who decides what's offensive. And in this case, in cases like that, it's going to be the administration or the executive board of a company and they're going to be thinking not necessarily about what offends them, but about their market. It's going to be a market-based decision. And so I find it ironic that the far right, which often is the home for people who are market-based zealots of their philosophy is all about the importance of free markets, don't like it when now in these questions of values, when a market-based decision gets made about whether this person is going to be able to go on making movies or whether this person is going to keep their job. And so it's that some of the rage seems to be displaced to me.
Well, I'm just absolutely puzzled by the argument that corporations are doing what they do out of market values. The idea that Twitter is banning people from talking about the potential Hunter Biden scandal. Facebook is now cutting people off, not letting their own paying customers talk about it because they don't like it.
Well, I think that's a completely different phenomenon.
But this is, let me just finish my point here. But this is exactly what you said. I don't believe that every corporation is just doing what's best for business. We have all sorts of examples where they are acting on the basis of their own politics. And that includes all of Silicon Valley, more or less. You've got a big blow up in the news now about Google employees who are calling out the culture, saying it's one-dimensional, that it's a political people playing God with elections. This is people inside of Google saying this now. So I find that to be a difficult argument to swallow wholeheartedly. But I do agree with you on one thing. I think you're exactly right. Chris Pratt probably won't be deplatformed. That means, will he continue to work in Hollywood? Yes. Will his positions, his opinions, cost him roles that will not cost Mark Ruffalo roles because of his more progressive values? I believe that's absolutely true. And so to me, cancel culture doesn't just matter if you've been erased. There's a number of different examples, just to throw a couple of more on the table while we're talking about this. We have a professor now. Let's start with this one. I won't take very long with this. But the other thing that bothers me about this is when we allow people to make those arguments, right? That, okay, your speech bothers me or bothers some aspect of my clientele. You work for me. I'm going to then find ways to minimize your ability to fight back or your ability. There are costs to challenging the orthodoxy that go way beyond, that don't have to mean canceling. So we got a situation here in a professor at a university who was found guilty of harassment at the university. The university decided he was guilty of harassment simply for asking a group of students if there were positive aspects of global trade in the Columbian period. Did something good happen globally when Columbus came to this world, or was it only negative? He was giving both sides of the story. He said, well, look, in some ways it was a huge negative, in other ways there were positives. Simply for saying that, a number of students protested, and the university found him guilty of harassment simply for saying that. Now, again, when you get into situations at universities, I've had this happen to me a number of times, where you're presenting both sides of a story, as this gentleman was. This is his specialty, right? He's a highly rated adjunct professor of history, and he was talking about the Columbian exchange, right? The traffic back and forth between pre- and post-Columbian societies. He made the argument at St. John's University that there were aspects of pre-Columbian, post-Columbian trade that were beneficial, and for that he was found guilty of harassment. My point, one more second, I'm done. My point is that all he was found guilty. Was he fired? No. But does that guilty verdict forever change the way that he's able to talk to his students as a professor? The answer is absolutely yes.
Well, I don't think that's a particularly good example of cancel culture, even what's meant by that. For reasons that you just said, that he was left in his position, and that there was a protocol. There was a protocol that was followed, and he might have been found guilty, but he was left in his position. And I think that particularly when it comes to this kind of phenomenon in universities, first, it's very difficult to recreate what actually happened in the classroom. We're not privy to the transcripts of whatever might have been testified to. I'm not familiar with that case at all. I am familiar with a few others, and even when you have relatively detailed information about what may or may not have happened, it's hard to necessarily get a sense of the presence and the atmosphere of that particular moment. And so I would just throw that out there as a kind of caveat to the whole discussion. But as well, I think that again, thinking about this in the context of universities and the instances of this when it's happening in the classroom, I think that something that needs to be said is that there's no guarantee that the values that you had, not necessarily you, Duke, but anyone had, that you had when you started as a professor 5 years or 10 years or 40 years ago, that's going to stay the same. Values shift over time. And, I think everybody, in the country right now is aware that we're going through a reckoning on race in our culture. And of course, that is going to mean that we are going to have to think anew about how we approach various kinds of subjects in the classroom. And if that means that you throw out a subject in the classroom and it turns out that you can't teach the thing that you wanted to teach, and you instead have to explain why you're wanting to teach that in the first place, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. So if this guy's guilty verdict means that he has to think differently about how he's going to teach that subject in the future, my tendency is to say, yes, good, that's probably progress.
So you're telling me that a group of students who are there to learn, who do not have the breadth of education, they are not specialists, they have not been hired by the university to teach a subject. When I teach, I'll give you an example. When I teach Shakespeare, I teach a play like Macbeth. And in Macbeth, there's that horrible scene where Lady Macbeth prays to the devil to unsex herself, right? She doesn't want to be a woman. Women are too gentle. She wants to be a man. She wants to be a killer. And whenever that passage comes up in the, I'm hired to teach Shakespeare to these kids. Whenever that passage comes up, I explain it. And I get endless condemnation for explaining it and not condemning Shakespeare. Because it seems to be an argument that demonstrates that changing one's gender is not easy. It's actually impossible. And the consequences of trying are dire. Now, that's what Shakespeare's position on this story. So I'm hired by the university to teach that. And so I do that. And then when I preside all the different ways you could see that, one student, a 20-year-old kid, decides that she's offended having to listen to it. And you're telling me that if I get censored for harassment for teaching that, I should look at this as an overall good and be forced because of her complaints to change the way I teach Shakespeare forever? That strikes me as something a darn bit more than just sensitivity in the face of changing values. You have not just changed values. You have done something much more than that.
I don't think I have. I mean, I'm not actually doing that, but I think that if you're forced to go back to how it is that you're attempting to explain that to your students, and you're having to reevaluate that because an explanation that may have worked perfectly fine 10 years ago is no longer working for the students you have today, that indicates a change in the culture that you, as a professor, as someone who has an education and as someone who has a deep knowledge base, should be able to accommodate. It shouldn't be you asking for a different pool of students. It should be you recognizing that your explanation is no longer good enough. And the second point I would make about that is really speaks to the broader subject. There was a really great piece by James Pogue in Baffler magazine called "On the Rudeness of Mobs." And what Pogue was doing was really taking the whole cancel culture thing and taking it from a much more macro and historical perspective, and recognizing that all revolutionary efforts begin with what objectively looks like mob activity. And that's not coming from your cultural elites, the people who are already entrenched in their positions of power. or the people that we think of as having that education that's got to be imparted to other people. And indeed, and what Pogue really spells out very carefully is that the American Revolution is a perfect example of that. That as the complaints began that resulted in the American Revolution, it wasn't coming from the educated elites of society at that time. It was coming from regular people who would have been thought of as not educated. And so I think that when we think of cancel culture and how it relates to that kind of activity, we should also be recognizing that we're lashing out at something that was absolutely essential to the creation of the nation that we enjoy.
Not all.
I'm just going to, Duke, I need to jump in. Duke, can I jump in just a second? I need to tell the audience that.
As long as I would get to respond to that, sure, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to let everybody know, both JC and Duke have sent us articles related to this phenomenon, and they're really great articles. Most of them are pretty short and very readable. Because we were unable to put them in chat, we'll be making them available on our website and also sending them out to participants via email. So you can look forward to learning more than just what we talked about here today. So with that, I
sent that one as a link, Tim, so I'm just going to repeat it. On the Rudeness of Mobs in the Baffler by James Pogue.
Okay, thanks. And take it away, Duke.
But JC, not every revolution leads to progress. There's a difference between the American Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution, for instance. There's a difference between the French Revolution and the revolution of the Nazis in the 1930s. And so one of the things that characterize certain kinds of revolutions is to take this protesting moment, like you're talking about, this young student who doesn't know Shakespeare, who's taken a class voluntarily, she objects to something she knows nothing about. The idea that that is some pristine moment that is going to change culture, well, maybe, but is it going to change it for the better? Not necessarily. And it's a hallmark of revolutions that gave us Nazism and Bolshevism that the kind of cancel culture we're talking about exploded. It is absolutely true that under Nazism and Bolshevism, communism, you had a system that was predicated on canceling people for their opinion. Certain opinions were not allowed. And if we start entertaining now, the idea that we can't the kid can push back against 2,000 years of Western culture, but when we as professors push back against her assumptions, that we're somehow hurting her feelings or belittling her burgeoning revolutionary spirit, that is the death of education in some ways. And so this idea that I find it very, very disturbing, right? That when we see rebellious behavior, say in a classroom, we see rejections of things, but that by kids who by their own admission don't know the history and the culture of. I look at Antifa in the streets today. I teach the kids. The kids who are in the streets are primarily college kids. I teach them. They don't know the things they're throwing away. They don't understand. Now, I'm not saying that it's my job or that I could possibly, or that education could possibly educate them in a way that would take that away from them. Let them be revolutionaries. But I guarantee you that most of them would be less revolutionary. They wouldn't be tearing down statues of abolitionists. They wouldn't be tearing down allies of their causes, statues, if they took a little more time to get an education. We have put politics and revolution before knowledge. And that's the big problem we have. Kids go to school now, kids go to colleges now, in many instances, to have their worldviews underlined and forwarded. The story I gave you before, and I'll throw one out there. We have a situation at Skidmore College, and all these links will be in what we send you. We have a professor at Skidmore College who is not even a conservative. He simply went and attended a Blue Lives Matter parade simply because he wanted to hear more about it. His students found out he was there, even though he didn't participate, he didn't wave any flags. They said that his behavior there, his 20-something students, was akin to racial violence. And he had no right to do that. So the Skidmore University is considering what to do with him right now. He's under formal investigation, like you said. He's in the process. But to me, here you have a professor who is curious. He attends a rally that his young students don't like. And their voice puts him through a dangerous and a time-consuming and emotionally draining process at this university. That's allowing the students way more power to cancel him than he ever potentially cancel him as he ever has against them. This is the disbalance of this is dangerous.
I mean, I think you know that I want to just address two little things about that. First, as you just said, he's not getting canceled. He's merely suffering some.
Don't say merely if you've never suffered that kind of an investigation, please. It's a serious thing.
I was a professor too for a time, so it's not as though I'm totally unfamiliar.
Have you been investigated for Title IX complaints? For what you say in the classroom?
No, and I would say that I share the view that sometimes that it's a good idea to bring offensive material into the classroom. I just never had the problem of students complaining about it. But I would say just to sort of one more thing on that, and I said this in the piece that I wrote for Columbia Journal in defense of cancel culture, that you really just can't tell a student what they should or should not be offended by. I think that's never going to be a kind of argument that's ever going to lead to any kind of agreement or consensus. But let me sort of switch gears, because I think that the phenomenon of what happens in university is really a tiny portion of the overall phenomenon. And the piece I wrote for Columbia Journal was really built off what I'd read in a pretty famous Supreme Court case, U.S. v. Alvarez, which is also known as the Stolen Valor case. And that case was really interesting because the Supreme Court ruled that a man's lie about having received the Congressional Medal of Honor was protected speech. Now, the reason they ruled that was because they thought that he'd already suffered recriminations for having done this by having been subjected to an online shaming campaign. Now, the argument that we're hearing a lot of these days, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or wherever, is that the solution to bad speech is good speech. And based on the Supreme Court decision in U.S. v. Alvarez, which was a 6-3 decision, including Roberts and Kennedy and the liberal wing of the court, and was authored by Kennedy, said pretty bluntly that what was important, what had already served as a check on this guy's lie in the public sphere, was the shaming campaign, which was rude and caustic and awful, which was the thing that enabled the court to not step in and put another restriction on speech. They didn't have to, because there was this public check in the form of people going on and humiliating this guy online. And so I think that the thing to remember then is as we think about this, in my view, the Supreme Court's already ruled on this, and it has ruled that this kind of speech, when it's in response to somebody like lying about receiving military honors, that is part of the good speech that is the counter to bad speech.
Well, fair enough, but the guy lied. It's a fact that he lied. He told an untruth. I'm not talking about people who lie. I'm talking about people who tell a different truth, who give the other side of a story. People who are telling, people like this professor who is saying, look, here are the benefits of that post. He's not lying to them. He's guilty of no crime. He does not need to be shamed for telling history accuracy any more than I should be shamed for showing them the other side of the scene with Lady Macbeth. And to go back to something you said before you started at the beginning of your conversation there, I think it's worthy of pointing out that it does matter at universities. I mean, the process is the problem. You say that, telling people what to think is never going to wage leverage. I mean, I find that astounding when we have a significant number of faculty members at universities who are telling kids exclusively one-sided liberal progressive things.
That's not what I said. I said that you can't tell someone what they should be offended by.
But it's happening now. A lot of these kids are being told they should be offended by Western culture. They should be offended by the founding. And maybe they should, maybe they shouldn't, but they're not getting any of the other answers.
I think we're making a lot of claims about what's happening in classrooms.
Well,
but I don't know that we can actually prove that outside
I can prove it right now.
request or outside of video of watching it. You know,
All right. Here's one of my links. Here's one of my links. It's from the College Fix. This is a result of a new poll that came out three weeks ago. Well,
we're talking about actually seeing what's happening in the classroom. It would be reasonable to create that out.
These are kids being polled. 20,000 college students, 20,000 nationwide were polled recently, and they were asked the question. Asked how willing are they? These kids were asked to listen to arguments that they disagree with. That's what they were asked. 20,000 is a huge sample. Here are the overall results. Most students don't want any guest speakers with controversial views on campus. 71% replied that they would oppose allowing any speaker on campus who would make any argument that would bother them, including arguments like transgender people have a mental disorder, or that Black Lives Matters, or that abortion should be completely illegal. So on whatever side, conservative or liberal. My concern is that because we have adults in the room, professors getting punished for speech, other professors telling kids wildly one-sided stories about the evils of Western culture. You've got kids now who think this. 71% don't want any controversial speech on campus at all, whether liberal or conservative. My argument is
you're conceding a couple of different things there, because you're saying that they don't want to hear anything that they disagree with, and then you're saying they don't want to hear anything that's controversial, and those two things are not synonymous.
But my point is that why are kids now, we've never had this issue before, why are college age kids deciding that they will not listen to ideas they dislike? Now what I'm suggesting is that movement, that move in our students comes from the fact that you do have a cancel culture, a culture that is arguing that ideas themselves are toxic and that feelings matter more than ideas. In your article, the one you wrote that you think that brought you here, I read it. I thought it was very well written. I disagreed with it, but ultimately you kept coming back to the argument that if somebody's feelings are hurt, let's honor that. And to me, that is a dangerous path to go down, because feelings by definition are subjective. Who gets to decide whose feelings matter? You said we live in an era. Good.
I think you're saying that students have these ideas because of something that they're hearing in other classes before they get to your class, I guess. But that doesn't really make any sense. And I think probably what's happening is that students are exposed to a lot more information before they get to the classroom these days than they were 15, 20, 25 years ago. And so that there's just a different phenomenon, a different kind of student. I noticed this. I taught from about 2005 to 2015. I could tell that there was a distinction from the students I had in 2005 and the ones I had in 2015. There was a big gap even there. And if again, we have to go back to the foundations of why we think certain kinds of ideas should be taught, and we have to overcome students' objection to it. That's good. That should be something that is good for professors to go through, even if it's uncomfortable, because it means that you have to go back to the beginning and ask yourself, well, why do I believe what I believe, and what can I communicate to my students about that in terms of the subject matter that I'm teaching? But again, you know, that we keep zooming back into the example of what's happening in universities, but the cancel culture idea is so much bigger than that, and is speaking to you know, how the media works, and so many other things that I'm a little frustrated that we keep focusing on what's happening in classrooms, when obviously we can't go into those classrooms to actually see the thing that's happening.
But you can't go into you can't go into the journalism offices, and you can't go into Hollywood either. We have the same problem in all the other areas. But I have to respond to what you just said. You just described a university classroom 180 degrees different than we have understood education for a long time. It is not the student's job to grapple with important issues. It's not the student's job to be pushed out of her comfort zones. It's not the student's job to have the student who's all of 19, right? It's not her job to have to try to accommodate her thinking to ideas that are bigger and broader than her experience. It's the professor's responsibility to constantly be changing what they know and what they think and what they're trained to do, because times are changing. And so the student basically is the professor, and the professor then is the student. I would humbly suggest to you that's where your university campus culture is coming, cancel culture is coming from. That worldview, that the student is the professor, and therefore the professor must become the student because of his old-fashioned ways and his backward adherence to traditional values. He's got to change. That's where I can only speak to this. That's where cancel culture comes from in colleges. That very attitude. I would simply humbly note that all of the best teachers I've ever known have always said that they learn as much from their students as they teach to them. Well, so do I. But we're talking about a certain kind of student here. And as I said before, not every idea leads to a good revolution. You'll admit that, right? That there are certain ways of viewing speech and behavior, or enforcing your will and beliefs on other people, your intolerance to hear ideas you don't like, that led to some really grave bad revolutions. Not all revolutions are good. Not all revolutions where we challenge the past lead to a better future. That has to be acknowledged. And when you've got young kids who do not have the life experience, who do not have the educational depth to be able to do this, to be able to think through, my point is, they more than me need to be exposed to ideas that they disagree with. And my job isn't to force bad ideas on them, but it's to try to broaden their minds so that the revolutions they do engage in aren't blind Jacobin revolutions, that there's more decency and thought and humanity behind them, rather than just this spill into the streets and loot and riot and pillage and burn down statues of friends even as foes. That strikes me as a dangerous outlet for largely ignorant, culturally ignorant kids in many respects. Well, I guess I choose not to look down on them in that way, and I don't have any problem bringing potentially offensive material into the classroom, and I haven't had any problem in attempting to explain why I'm doing that if it does become an issue. I think that there are still ways to go about that. And so it's again, it feels like we keep straying off into a separate subject.
I'm going to in here and say it's about that time where I'll give you each a couple minutes to try to wrap up or summarize your thoughts about cancel culture, and then we'll go to some audience Q&A. So JC, if you want to go first, and then Duke, and then we'll head to the Q&A.
Sure. I guess in conclusion, I think, as I said in my piece, that I think that ultimately, when we think about cancel culture, what we have to reconcile ourselves to is that the Supreme Court has already pretty much had its say on the subject. And were it to actually get litigated again, it's likely that they'd come back with the same statement, which is that what we're calling cancel culture can serve an important cultural function, and that it is a version of the good speech that is intended to counter bad speech. And it is precisely because we have that we don't have to impose further restrictions on free speech. That said, my piece does conclude with an argument that was actually just echoed in a big piece by Emily Bazelon in the New York Times Magazine called "The Problem of Free Speech in an Age of Disinformation," in which she presents an argument that it might be time for us to do some soul searching and some serious thinking about what the First Amendment is supposed to be trying to achieve, and maybe coming to the conclusion that as a result of technological advances or cultural forces, that it's not doing and is no longer capable of doing what it was meant to do originally. Well, the First Amendment, in my mind, was meant to protect free speech for everybody.
And it's done a pretty good job up until recently when we've decided that we're going to use speech of one group to silence and cancel another. We've done pretty well for 250 years. I don't think the answer now is to give into a view that some speech should always be stopped. I just don't buy it. Second of all, the Supreme Court did in that one legal decision say what you said. But you know the funny thing? As these cases spill out of people being unjustly fired, terminated for their view, people are being untenured, people are being removed from their jobs for saying things that otherwise we would have been normal to say 10, 20 years ago. People are being canceled. And when and beyond that too, when those things spill into the courts, over the last 3 years, the students and the professors are winning those cases. When you think about the imbalance now in the old the rewriting of Title IX under the Obama administration, where you got to now lower the due process for young males accused of sexual assault. You made it easier for girls to make claims. You took away a lot of protections of the Constitution. Those are now, the boys are losing on campus, but when it ends up in those very same courts that you're talking about, they're winning left and right because of the violation of the constitutional rules. Seems to me that getting rid of the Constitution or reconsidering the First Amendment, that it might not be doing what it's meant to do. What it's meant to do is to guarantee speech, even speech that is hateful. And if we decide as a people, and some of us decide as a people, a very select few of us decide that to be a Republican might be hate speech, to be pro-life might be hate speech, to suggest that marriage might be between a man and a woman, that kind of speech, to suggest those things now is a hate crime and must be banished, I will stick with the Constitution, and I hope most people will as well. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. Questions? I'll scroll around on the chat function here. In the meantime, as we're waiting for somebody to jump in with one, let me just ask if there's some kind of limit to how far cancel culture can go, and if so, where's that line? And if not exactly that one, also I'm sort of interested in how we decide who is it that deserves canceling. Is there any principled basis in which we say, well, that statue's okay, but that one needs to come down, or you know what I mean? Is it just a matter of subjective feelings, or is there some kind of a principled basis for that?
Well, in the case that I've done work on, this doctor, the evil gynecologist J. Marion Sims, it was a case where it began with an effort that would have been called cancel culture, with picketing and people making noise in the streets, literally. And I caught wind of it. I'd heard of it, and I knew that this was happening. And then I did the forensic work to sort of dig into the guy's history to see what could be found. And it turned out that more or less his entire biography was a house of cards. And I think that there's how do you decide who or who gets canceled or who doesn't? I think that the San Francisco Public School District just did, and I haven't researched this heavily, so I could be getting some of the facts wrong. Just created a list of schools that are named for various people, and some of them are pretty obviously people that you might want to think about not having your school named for that person anymore. They were slave owners or something, and maybe that was really the only thing they were known for. I don't know. But what the San Francisco public school system did or seemed to do was more or less put all the names up for a vote. So even the school named for Dianne Feinstein is up for a vote. And I think that when you decide, well, who should be canceled or who shouldn't, ultimately it does come down to, what the collective will decides. And in terms of either individuals acting in concert on forums like Twitter or Facebook, or through their representatives, or by putting pressure onto their representatives who then vote for something. So I think there's a process, and and as Duke was saying in summing up, when there's a process, when a professor is subjected to some kind of critique, and that goes into a process, and maybe they're winning those cases, well, good. So they've won their case, but there's been a process, and that's all part of the conversation that we're having about our values. And of course, it's going to be the case that in some instances, a professor is teaching a class and students complain about it, and the administration comes along and says, no, that one's actually fine. And that's great. There was a process. And I think that what cancel culture is really speaking to is really situations when there isn't a process, and I think probably there should be. And I think that when it goes too far, which was the first part of your question, Tim, I think that when it becomes criminal, when there was just a case in France just the other day where a student was offended that his teacher showed a picture of Muhammad and he beheaded his teacher, right? Obviously, that's criminal. That's not what anybody wants. There was a great kind of counter letter to the Harper's letter that was called a more specific letter on justice and open debate, and that I think there is going to be a link to, that went through all of the examples that Harper's listed, and there was one where this group that was is equally group authored, 120 people or something that signed it. There was one there, they said, well, this one actually sounds bad. This one sounds like that something wrong is happening, and that shouldn't happen. So I think that people who are on the side of the debate that are in favor, or are at least recognizing the value of this particular kind of public discourse, are more than willing to step up and say, no, in this case, this is wrong. That there should be a recourse to that, and so I think that we're talking about a spectrum of phenomenon. We're not always talking about how it's always wrong to be doing this. Sometimes it's wrong to be doing it, and sometimes it's right to be doing it.
I would like to point out to you, though, too, sir, that the process is always dictated. Just because there's a process doesn't mean it's a fair process. If the only one who's adjudicating your case is the university who wants to punish you for speaking the truth or saying something that is unarguably true about history, that's not a legitimate process. San Francisco, the people of San Francisco aren't voting on those school change names. The San Francisco City Council is deciding themselves what they're going to do about them. I don't consider the San Francisco Council enough of a process to make that decision. That's a decision that affects everybody who lives in San Francisco. Everybody should have a vote on it, not just the council.
They get to vote their members in. That's just.
JC, these people were voted in before the question came up. These people on the council brought the question up. They're going to decide it. So even if you vote them out next time, they will have decided. My point to you.
I don't think that makes sense. That makes sense, Duke, because of course, every time you vote for someone into an elected position, you recognize that you're empowering them to do what is going to be in their power, whether it's raising questions like that or whether it's passing certain kinds of laws. I think that's just inherent to what a democracy is.
Right. So you're basically saying you're all for processes, even if they are incredibly limited and they disenfranchise most people. You're okay with it.
I think in the case of a university, if a university professor is accused of something and then doesn't like the process, the university professor is not compelled to stay at that school. That university professor
take the argument you just made and turn it around from a university professor to a minority student who opposes something at the university. You wouldn't dare, I think, turn around and say to that kid who doesn't feel like he's getting justice, some racial minority who's protesting some long-standing prohibition to something that hurts him. The progressives would never dare say to a minority kid, if you don't like it, you can always go to school somewhere else. But when it comes to these kinds of issues, when it comes to issues where you have, generally speaking, conservatives in the crosshairs, we're really quick to say, go work somewhere else. That's all part of the double standard.
I think that it would be pretty easy in the case of offering courses that are potentially going to have the kind of material we're talking, things that are offensive, trigger warning kind of stuff. Obviously, those kinds of classes are different than Algebra 1, right? And so I think that as universities, as they think about how they offer those courses, when students can drop, when can they get full tuition back, there are things that universities could do to ameliorate the situation rather than having a blanket policy for all the different courses in a university. I can certainly think of situations, in support of your point, where a student might be complaining about something and where I would say, well, I don't think that's a valid complaint. And in fact, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about all of these processes that where the university looks at it, does an investigation, and then decides that the professor maybe needs to, to be censored a bit, or maybe, or maybe there's a middle ground, but they're left in their positions. So the conversation is going on, and I'm just saying that conversation is a good conversation to be having in a culture that is changing very, very rapidly.
Your answers always seem to come default on the part of the students, which is a little troublesome to me. The one example was you weren't for the guy who got beheaded because they showed the picture of Muhammad. Would you say to that professor that he would have been better served?
That's
not
criminal.
showing the picture. I mean,
that's criminal. If anybody's doing anything against a professor that is criminal, then it's just flat wrong.
But trying to deny the professor work and sustenance for his family because you don't like his opinions, that's also trying to hurt him.
No, I'm not trying to do that. I'm
culture students are
saying that if you're teaching at a university that has got an administrative structure that you don't like, you opted in for that when you took the job.
Right. So ultimately, that what it comes down to. It's not a case of justice. It's and even if you got bogus processes, you signed on for the job, so you know what you got into. It just, you accuse me. No, don't misunderstand my rhetoric here. But at one point you said at the beginning of your talk, I'm always amazed about how you conservatives come back when it comes to free markets. You suddenly start to gripe. It's always amazed me that progressives, when it comes right down to it, when the shoe's on the other foot, they're more than happy to tell conservative people go take another job than they are to find solutions. The way you go out of your way to protect students, even students of bad will, at the expense of professors, right, is the exact equivalent of what you said at the beginning of this. That it's interesting how progressive people, when the shoe's on the other foot, will suddenly tell people like me, well, if you don't like it, take another job.
I guess I'm not seeing how the shoe's on the other foot, and I'll just stand by the observation that once you take a job, you've opted in for that position, and
isn't that true? Isn't that true of the student who opts into the university with isn't that true of the student who opts into the university who has the professor who teaches the traditional way?
Yes, it is.
But you started out and you said all throughout, it's the professor's job to change his opinion based on that.
But part of what the student has opted in for is that if they encounter something that is offensive,
they can try to get you fired.
They have the opportunity to file a complaint about that.
Right. And so we have a system.
And that may or may not be an attempt to get you fired.
Sure.
It might be an attempt to simply, get their tuition back if it's late in the semester or something. I don't know. We're speaking hypothetically, and again, in these kinds of examples, I don't even really think fall under what we should be calling cancel culture.
So to fit, this will be my last comment. We've got people waiting to chime in, and I'll make it a short one. So when students, in good faith or bad faith, attack their professors or try to get their professors in trouble, whether it's legitimate or not, that's what they signed on for. We as professors, when it turns out that those claims are bogus, or when we try to fight back, or if the university punishes us, well, that's just what we signed on for. So the students have no responsibility in this. They can fake claim all they want. They can do whatever they want, and that's part of their process. But the process of professors is much more limited. That'll be my final statement on the whole thing.
Hi, I have a quick question for Duke. I was wondering, are you mad, or is your microphone just like really loud? Because it sounds like you're really loud for some reason.
I'm loud anyway, but my microphone may be too high. No one else has suggested that. If anybody had mentioned it, I could have turned it down. So if I'm yelling in your ears, I apologize. But animated, I always am. That's just the way I am.
Okay, but I do have an actual question.
Sure.
So do you think that there is ever a time where somebody should be like quote unquote canceled or like kind of turned down? Or do you think that people should just kind of, I don't want to say deal with it because that's not an appropriate way of saying it, but kind of just like accept that somebody will say something that they don't always want to hear? Or do you think that there could be an instance where like something is offensive enough that?
Of course, we have rules. I mean, if you're using racial epithets against kids in class, that's beyond the pale. I mean, there are obvious places where people step. I don't think anybody's arguing that. And certainly not me. I'm not saying it's okay to scream fire in a movie theater. I'm simply saying that when you look at who's being canceled, more and more people are being canceled because of their political worldviews. If you have a chance, take a look at the list of stories, the list of articles that I've sent that Tim will post. We have actually 2 cases where students are being removed from student government. You have a Latina student at a university. She was on student government. 10 years earlier, when she was much younger, as a Latina student, she actually criticized illegal immigration. Not meanly, not violently. She just criticized it. She was removed by her student government peers 10 years later because her texts came up. You have another situation in a student government where one young man was the president of the student government. He was, and you can see these in the links that Tim will post. He is a devout Catholic. So as a devout Catholic, he has spent much of his time arguing against abortion. He was unseated and removed from the student government by the other people because the argument that pro-life might be a thing was hate speech. That kind of stuff. Politicizing political worldviews, attacking people because their religion has a different view of certain things than you do. People who are just that kind of stuff, I think, that's beyond the pale. Or people who, like the professor who was suspended for harassment, right? Simply arguing that something good might have come from the Columbian period, the post-Columbian period, that is not racial hostility. It's pointing out a historical fact. And so those kind of things is where I draw the line.
Okay, I do. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just had a question based on your like the pro-life aspect of things and how you say like if somebody's pro-life that could be taken as a hate speech. I'm
saying to be pro-life is not hate speech. Yes.
Yes. Sorry, but I'm saying like if somebody either pro-life or pro-choice, but if they took like extreme measures where they were like attacking somebody or like threatening them like on either side of the argument, do you think that
I go back to JC was 100%. JC was right. We do not promote criminal actions. That's a criminal action. Clearly, defensively criminal action. Threatening somebody's life.
So Duke, if I can go back to what you said about yelling fire in a crowded theater, that's already understood to be one of the prohibitions on free speech. We're already not allowed to do it. You asked pretty early on, and then you just repeated it. You came back to hate speech, and maybe at least in terms of the slice of cancel culture that is about the use or the utterance of racial epithets in contexts or in any context is something that people are thinking about. You asked kind of early on about hate speech. Well, who decides this?
That's right.
Who decides what is hateful? And we do have a solution for that. The courts decide this, and you can fall back on the kind of whiny complaint that people have about Potter Stewart's argument about pornography. I know it when I see it, but the truth is that our entire judicial system works on that. By if in a criminal case, a judge might be called upon to determine who's lying between 2 different people. And they just have to make their call. They're a judge. That's what they do. And I think that maybe, at least in terms of this portion of cancel culture, we're having a broad conversation about what is hateful and how we determine that and what do we do about it. And all of these minor skirmishes that are happening at universities are part of that larger conversation. And again, if we are recalibrating for a new century and a new era in terms of technology, what is hate? I think that's a good thing.
I want to congratulate you on your humanity. I really admire it, but I want you to understand this too. Way before it ever gets into a court, if you're going through an expensive, an emotionally draining, interior process. You're assuming that these university processes are themselves apolitical. They're not. They're just not. Like anything else is apolitical. If I were to say anything else is apolitical, you would rightly shoot back at me. Everything has a political dimension. So too these committees. They are expensive. It's costly. By the time redress is made 2 years after the initial complaint, I think of my colleague John McAdams down at Marquette University, who was untenured for 3 years, while this meandered through Marquette, the complaint against him meandered through Marquette, then to the lower courts. It made it all the way to the Supreme Court in Wisconsin before they ruled in his favor and they reinstated him. But that's 3 years of teaching that he will never get back. This is the process itself may end well, but you should, and just flip this over to the process that African Americans have had to do. You say, I'm not drawing a moral equivalent between what happened to John McAdams and what happens to African Americans. I'm simply saying we would be the first ones to point out that African Americans very often, when we tell them to rely on the system, rely on the process, will look you in the eye and they'll tell you correctly, well, that system hasn't always been fair, ethical, or humane. That goes the other way as well. And we're quick to recognize the one, and we're not so quick to recognize the other. I want equal recognition that systems, by definition, aren't necessarily fair, and people of all sorts of different backgrounds, complexions, and worldviews find themselves treated, mistreated, or unfairly treated by all of these so-called checks and balances.
Well, I mean, I guess I think that that's just kind of running far afield of the conversation. You're complaining about imbalance in the court system or imbalance in administrations and universities.
You brought up the courts as the answer. I'm just pointing out to you that you brought it up as the answer. I'm just saying it's not as much of an answer as you think it is.
But I if we're not talking about cancel culture anymore, then cancel culture is not the problem.
No, we are.
Then the courts is the problem.
You keep saying that the process is the solution. I'm just simply, it's your argument, not mine. I just keep pointing out that processes are politicized too. That just because I enter a process does not mean I'm going to get a fair hearing any more than anybody else does. And so maybe the question is, and of course this is important to cancel culture, because your answer seems to be only that. And if that's the only alternative you're going to give me, I respectfully want others as well.
I guess we're talking about cases where somebody is investigated for something, and then the university comes to their defense and they're left in their position. And the complaint is, well, they took 3 years, or now they have to think differently about how they teach. It sounds like you're not taking yes for an answer. You know, that you're winning these cases.
Do you not recognize that yes comes with a lot of money spent and a lot of time and a lot of angst and a lot of anxiety?
I am, but all, part of me just says, well, boo-hoo, I don't care. The larger question about what the culture as a whole, on a macro level, you keep thinking of these micro incidents and thinking that you can dive into these classrooms and figure out exactly what happened. I'm thinking about the macro, because that's what cancel culture is really about. It's what's happening in the culture as a whole, not what's happening at some tiny university somewhere.
Every macro incident starts with a microaggression, right? I mean, look, this is not off the pale, because I know, well, I really do believe this, JC.
What is much more important to be thinking about is those instances when there is no protocol, when people are getting canceled, when they have nobody to actually turn to. They don't have an administration to come to their back and leave them in their position. That after a 2-year battle, those are the cases that are more interesting and are maybe more troubling even in thinking about what cancel culture is doing. But irrespective, all of that stuff seems like small potatoes compared to recognizing that the culture is engaged in a new debate about our values and about the exact nature of our founding documents. And I think that's good. We're long overdue for that.
I'm just going to jump in here. Duke?
I have one more sentence. I'm done. One more sentence. I'm done. Given
Okay.
our philosophical differences and where you are on the political spectrum and what I am, it doesn't surprise me that your default is to the collective and my default is to the individual. Make of that what you will.
Okay, with that, I think I'm going to say thanks so much to JC and Duke for joining us today. I actually have quite a few notes written down here, and I'm looking forward to reading the articles you both have sent. So we really appreciate that. Thanks to our audience for joining us tonight. If you're in Wisconsin
excuse
or
me.
Minnesota, good luck driving home in the snow or whatever you might have in front of you.
Tim,
Have a safe night. Yes,
There's a-
Ellen?
Daniel has had his hand up for a question for quite a while.
Hmm.
Can he ask his question before we leave?
I don't see a hand up.
Yeah,
Daniel Sinkovitz. Yes, it's been up for quite a while.
yes.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry, Daniel. Let me also say, though, I mean, we're well into overtime. If people have places they need to go ahead and stay. But if our two guests will stay for Daniel's question, I'm happy to let us keep going.
Sure.
Fire away, Daniel.
So hopefully I can be heard. So I guess I have a question, but I guess a few comments in response to what's been
There's something wrong with the microphone. We're not able
Yeah,
to.
can't hear him.
Yeah.
I'll fix it.
It sounds like it's really slowed down for some reason.
Sauron has joined us.
Yeah, he sounds different than last night. Not working.
Sorry.
He's going to write it down.
I think so. Yeah, our chat is not up again tonight.
All right, you hear me now?
Oh, there we go. Perfect.
Okay, all right. I don't know why my computer wasn't working, but all right. So I guess I've got I got a question, but I got just a few comments. So I guess, JC, haven't you heard the phrase that the process is punishment? So I think that's the idea of process, that sometimes just going through the process is punishment enough. But maybe you already know this. And I think that you seem to think that it's okay you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. But I feel like, anyway, whatever. I won't rehash that. You guys have already talked about that. Okay, so you had said something earlier, JC, about that someone is telling students don't have a right to be offended. And I don't think that's really true. I think cancel culture is no one's saying that students don't have a right to be offended. But cancel culture is this idea that certain classes of people, like students, that are deemed to have less power, are sort of given extra power, that they have the right to punish others for offending them. Back against being offended, they can respond to speech with organized harassment or appeal to a higher authority to crush that speech and to put people out of a job. It seems to me kind of like the principle of what's called a lèse majesté laws, where you can't insult the king, but now you can't insult students. If you do, there's hell to pay. And I think people really are being.
You're likening the position of a student to the position of a king. You know,
Yes.
I think one of the big distinctions in thinking about cancel culture is you're talking about the difference between people who have established positions of influence and people who really don't have a voice at all. And I think
it's inverting it. It's saying they don't have a voice.
You know, this is part of the reason why I think it's bad to focus on what's happening in universities, because once if you're a college student, you've already got some agency, you've already got some voice, and you know, and I think that to discourage them from using that would be a bad idea in the first place. But we're really talking about people who are even further outside, who really don't have any way of making their voice heard, and so that actually speaks to my mind to what's actually more important to be talking about when it comes to cancel culture.
I would just simply respond for my 2 cents. We live in a culture now and a world now where nobody has to be voiceless. The idea that there are completely disempowered voices, I don't buy it. Not in this day and age. Now having said that, do some people have bigger platforms and megaphones? Sure. But I still maintain this thought that the discussion we had on the macro level with universities would apply, in my thinking, to every other aspect of cancel culture, not just universities.
I would just say I feel like it's a disproportionate response to say that someone says something or someone is discovered to have a certain opinion, controversial or otherwise, that means they need to lose their job. I mean, only if it's directly related to their job. I really feel like there should be protections against this, that there should not be mob action to pressure bosses to make someone lose their job.
There are protections against it. It's that process that you don't like. You know, and the people that we're talking about almost invariably are not people who've lost their jobs.
There's a lot of people who have lost their jobs.
Yeah, we haven't talked about,
what is it? James Watson got kicked out of the center that he started, and he discovered the DNA double helix.
There have certainly been people who have lost their job. We're talking about universities. You know, though I mean, we're the editor of the Paris Review, and there was a guy from the National Poetry Foundation. Those are actually more interesting cases to my mind. But when we're talking about university professors, you know, that you're saying, well, they can't just get fired, and they don't, because there is that process that you don't like.
But JC,
it might wind up becoming a pithy cliche, but that doesn't mean that it's not available or that it's not functioning. It is.
JC, just because more people haven't been fired doesn't mean we should be very concerned about the ones who have, and we should be also concerned about the ones who are
talking about the ones who have.
Well, but cancel culture is not just only relevant when somebody gets their head cut off. There are people who've driven all sorts of levels of cancel culture. Look, having your fellowship taken away, not being able to, having to step down for your position at the university, running an organization because you've been removed back down to a faculty member. You're being canceled in subtle ways, being removed from a student graduate council because you're an Orthodox Catholic. You're not being done away with, but he can no longer serve as a student governor. That is a kind of canceling.
Not to mention the chilling effect of those who see what happened in the process and say, I don't want to go through that. I mean, I was counseled by another professor about how to be careful about what to say, because he went through a process that went all the way up, and he was told he needs to be more careful about what he says. And that was it. And it was an offhand remark that was misinterpreted. It wasn't even an opinion as far as I remember. So I feel like I think know that is like
this speaks to something that popped up in the Harper's letter, in which, you know, the writers of the Harper's letter collectively complained about administrators or editors who were removed from their positions for what they called clumsy mistakes. And of course, that's a post facto judgment call. And the letter, you know, that I cited, I think it's called a more specific letter on just, I'm not getting the total title correct, but they went through and they actually got very specific about the cases and what their determination was, and they were willing to identify those moments when an act of cancel culture, for lack of a better phrase, seemed to be misguided. They were willing to point to those into those instances. But in these instances which seem to be referred to in a very abstract way as these clumsy mistakes made by administrators, turned out to not, it wasn't that at all. So I think that even the way that you're phrasing it, which is similar to that, is ultimately a judgment call. And outside of a process, I don't know how you would get to the bottom of whether it is that thing. You would need an investigation, and you would need a judge who's empowered to say, yes, I think that's what's happening, or I don't.
But at the same token, JC, at the same token, you would.
We're lashing out at the system. We're lashing out at the legal system and saying, well, it's all unfair. It's all unfair. It just seems whiny. And what other possible course of action could we have?
Here's the other course of action. I don't think it needs to go always to the process. I feel like the process could be cut short for things that are clearly just simple mistakes, or clearly a student who's more irate than they need to be.
That it's
Administrators don't need to give in to a mob to investigate everything.
You're saying you don't want a judge to decide because you want to decide what has just been a simple mistake.
Yeah, but JC, I really do believe if when you put the shoe on the other foot, you've got people spilling out into the streets, engaging in some cases violent, you call it revolution, complaining, whining about the system. Right. And on that side, you're completely on their side. You can see clearly that what young African Americans are screaming for in the streets, a system that worked for them. You recognize that. You're good with that. But you can't possibly imagine a world, an institutional world, where people of different backgrounds could go through something. You can't even have no imaginative sympathy that other process could be not on the same level, but could be equally undercut.
Particularly when it comes to the American system, your ability to go out and engage even in caustic, rude, inappropriate speech is part of the system. You're not departing from the system when you do that. You're part of the system. And again, my larger point, the Supreme Court has already said that this kind of speech serves an important critical function inside of society as a check on other kinds of speech. It's already, it's established law. It's a precedent.
It was one case. And there have been many cases where higher courts, even the Supreme Court, have voted on behalf of those who have been wrongly terminated or affected by their positions.
Kennedy's decision in that case cited many other First Amendment cases.
It doesn't stop the fact that people who are getting terminated and canceled are winning in the courts. It doesn't. Those cases did not stop other cases from being won on the other side. It just didn't.
Well, I don't know that any of the James Bennett or Lauren Stein or some of the prominent media figures, Bill O'Reilly, did he sue? Did he try to sue? Over this? Did he try to go?
Because Bill O'Reilly did what he was accused of doing. If he had thought he was innocent, he would have tried it. All your cases are for people who've done obviously bad things. We're not talking about those guys.
You're okay with cancel culture as long as people deserve it. But you want to eliminate it because
I'm never for cancel culture. You see, in my definition, it's not cancel culture if you break the law and pay the price. That's not cancel culture. That's called justice.
But if
you didn't break the law, if you didn't transgress that way, and you still get canceled, that's cancel culture.
Speaking specifically of the case that I wrote about, the statue in New York City, the only reason why anybody started looking at it was because people decided that it was time to get rude about it, and to protest and to march in the streets.
So you'd be okay if I decide something has to be done about cancel culture. So I'm going to get really rude and offensive in the classroom as a way of starting this discussion. You're going to be 100% beside me on that? You're going to defend my right to do that and champion this as a cause? And you're going to stand up to me against the university?
If you're engaging in free speech, sure.
Every aspect of every example I've given you today have been free speech issues.
I have a quick question based on the free speech part of thing. I understand, I support that you can say what you want to say and, say what you believe and all that. But don't you think that it does come to a point where there are things that just simply shouldn't be said, regardless of different settings, whether it's in the classroom, it's in a restaurant, whatever the setting is?
Yeah, I did what you just said 10 minutes ago, right? You don't get to yell fire in a crowded movie theater. Of course. Yes, of course. But the point is, none of the things that I've been putting forth rises anywhere near that level. None of the examples that we've been talking about here rise anywhere close to those examples.
But Duke, I think what you're saying then is you're saying that all the examples you've given are professors, exerting their free speech in the classroom, but then when the students exert their free speech and complaining about it, that's what you don't want, right? No. I mean, I think this is what the Harper's letter. This is the duplicity of the Harper's letter. Is that ultimately what they're saying is that their free speech is being inhibited, and they want to pressure the free speech of others to preserve the position that they have in society. And so I think that if we're not, if a student is allowed to say that they're offended, and if they're allowed to initiate an investigation, then there's just nothing to complain about.
No, that's not what I said. What I said is that students, as Daniel pointed out, Daniel Sinkovitz, that we have created a system where students have carte blanche to say anything about any professor at any time, even without evidence. And if it turns out that there's nothing to it, there are absolutely no consequences for false accusations. None. Zero. That's a problem. Because in the court of law, there are consequences for false accusations. There are none in cancel culture university situations. So in other words, as Daniel rightly pointed out, we have given, in some instances, superpowers to students in regards to speech, and we have actually compromised the speech of professors to give them that.
Again, I think that's I don't think that's completely invalid. But I think that's an issue to take up with the administration. It's not an issue to take up with the students by telling the students that they should shut up and listen because they don't know enough yet.
No one's telling the kids to. It's not an either or. Shut up and listen. We're trying to get through to kids that being an adult means having to deal with ideas that you don't like in a civilized manner. That you can disagree with people without having to throw a brick through a wall or pulling a statue down in the quad. That is becoming much harder to do because of this imbalance that we've given, as Daniel pointed out, to students. There's Daniel.
Yeah, I would say the response is not shut up and listen. It's speak up in class.
Exactly. Speak up, but then don't get offended if somebody speaks equally vehemently on the other side of that exact same issue.
Well, I think Duke, you just shot yourself down. You're saying, well, don't get offended. That
Somebody else speaks.
Yeah,
exactly.
You really just can't
Everybody gets speech. Everybody gets it.
You can't tell other people when they should be offended or not. You just can't.
Like you are radically, you are unjustly characterized.
You just said.
I just said everybody should be able to say whatever they want. And if you're going to have the right to say something potentially offensive, somebody else has that same right. It comes back to our initial question. I don't trust any one group or person or council to decide what's legitimate and illegitimate speech. We are much better off with the First Amendment as it stands, that even speech that is unpleasant, as long as it doesn't quote certain, like you said, with pornography, certain obviously recognizable borders, that let all speech stand and let the best arguments win. I'm not telling kids when they should or shouldn't be offended. I'm saying don't be surprised if you have full range to say whatever you want, that I might have that full range too. That's all I'm saying.
Well, I think that the pornography argument and the Potter Stewart statement is not a case in which everything is clear. I mean, Potter Stewart's usually gets derided for having said, I know it when I see it, because it's obviously the case that he's thinking in terms of his particular temporal frame of reference, and values are going to change over time. And so that what Potter Stewart thinks in 1976 or whenever that statement was written is not necessarily going to apply in 2006 or 2020 or 26. And so I think that again, what I think is patently obvious to everybody is that we are going through turmoil in terms of our values, in terms of what we think about the First Amendment, and all of these instances in which actions are initiated by groups or by individuals are part of a much larger conversation.
And
that's
I see you.
Going to be good in terms of bringing our society in concert, our laws of our society in concert with our values.
And I say to you, we have had 250 years of those kinds of crises. This isn't the first one. This isn't the most. It's just the most recent. And for 250 years, where we've had the Civil War was a greater period of conscience than this is. And we got through it on the First Amendment. We got through it on the Constitution. It seems to me that the idea we've reached the point now where we have to start altering the Constitution, which does start at a zero sum, right? All speech is protected. And in instances where certain speech is dangerous to others, then there are, as you said, there's processes. But that's a hugely high bar to get to.
So I'm gonna jump in again here and say it's about 6 o'clock.
Sure.
So I actually have to take off. I have another commitment I have to get to. I mean, I've enjoyed this tremendously. I hope everyone involved has, but I need to shut things down.
Thank
So
you.
Thanks, Tim.
thanks
Thank
again to JC and Duke. Thanks to all our guests,
Thanks, JC.
and have a good evening, folks.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.